Well, lads, hope you're doing well, and welcome to another Q&A episode. First question is, how should I adjust my nutrition if I'm training twice a day? So there are a couple of cases that could be present here. One being that you are asking if you're regularly training twice a day, how would you adjust your nutrition? And another might be that you find yourself training twice a day as a one-off. But in general, training twice a day puts a significant amount of demand on your body. So your nutrition will need to support that. If that's on an ongoing basis, then even more so. But even if it's not, we need to be thinking about how we're going to fuel for both those sessions and have some aspect of support and recovery in between. And the key here is ensuring that you're, again, adequately fueling before each session, refueling between sessions, and then obviously recovering appropriately between and certainly after the two sessions. And the first thing to consider with that is your overall energy intake. When you're training twice a day, your calorie requirements for that day, or if you're training twice a day regularly, your calorie requirements in general are going to be higher than someone who's just training once. So we want to ensure that your total daily intake of calories and food is sufficient to cover 2 sessions a day. So a good starting point with that would be to think of increasing your overall calorie intake for that day by somewhere between like 300 and 500, could be a lot more, could even in some cases be less, just depending on what the sessions are consisting of. But there will certainly be a benefit from increasing your calories, at least to some extent. Then when it comes to fueling the actual sessions themselves, that first session is going to be fueled just as any other session would, by having a good solid mixed meal, generally wanting to contain some form of carbohydrates. The closer it is maybe to that session, the more that will be simple carbohydrates versus, having time before that session might mean you can get in some more complex carbohydrates and a normal regular meal, as well as having some aspect of protein in there and a hydration component along with that, whether that is having a drink along with it or simply just sipping on some fluids throughout the process leading up to that first session, and having some electrolytes in there either via the meal or through the fluids that you're consuming. But the main difference then when it comes to twice a day training is what you're doing between those 2 sessions. If you have, say, 1 session in the morning and 1 session in the evening, then you have a lot of time in between to focus on refueling and a little bit of recovery, as well as rehydrating in between those sessions. Whereas the closer those sessions are together, the more we have to think about what we're doing with our nutrition. So if those sessions again are spread out, say morning and evening, then I would recommend just going about your usual daily intake as you would for any other training day, but having a little bit more fuel in there in the form of carbohydrates, in the form of extra calories in general. But if it gets closer to, if the session 1 is closer to session 2 than that, then we want to start looking at how we can do those things, the refueling, the rehydrating, and some aspect of recovery, but doing it in a way that's not going to lead to digestive upset by that next session, and it's also allow us to get in plenty of those nutrients that we want to get in. Similarly, as we talked about fueling that first session, the closer that session is to the previous session, the more we want to focus on foods that are a little more simpler, a little bit more digestible. And from a carbohydrates point of view here, we're talking about more simple carbohydrates like white rice, pasta, things like bagels potentially, things like even liquid calories in the forms of, say, fruit juice or carbohydrate drinks, sports drink, etc., if we're getting very close in between those sessions. And from a protein standpoint, we can start to look at things that are a little bit lower in fat, so lean protein sources like chicken, for example, or even, again, looking at the liquid side of things, something like a protein powder or a Greek yogurt with granola, for example. And again, keeping overall fiber content and fat content relatively low the closer those sessions are to each other, because we want to, again, get in plenty of carbohydrates, get in plenty of protein, get in plenty of fluids, but minimize the total volume of food within the stomach and how long that's going to take to get through the digestive system, again, for the purposes of avoiding digestive discomfort and for improving the speed at which we're getting those nutrients, the carbs, proteins, and the fluids to the working muscles. So we covered there getting your overall calorie intake for the day up to a level that's higher than your usual intake. Also fueling that first session as you normally would fuel a session with your nutrition, and then looking at the time in between those 2 sessions and asking yourself, is there enough time between those sessions that I can just eat as I normally would and know that that food is going to have the time to pass through the digestive system appropriately? Or is it a little bit closer where I then need to consider having more simple foods, more quickly digesting and absorbing foods in order to get the nutrients, the carbs, the proteins and the fluids into the system without it causing that digestive upset. And then off the back of that, after the 2 sessions are fully completed, you can go about eating as you normally would, but putting more of a focus then on getting in plenty of good quality fruits, vegetables, etc., and even having some healthy fats in there, because we know that we've been decreasing those throughout the day as a means of improving or increasing the speed at which the food is getting through the digestive system. Second question is, I'm constantly getting colds during heavy training periods. Could my nutrition be a factor? It's absolutely, nutrition can definitely be a factor when it comes to your immune function, especially during periods of heavy training and intense training as well as high volume. So when you're training hard, you're putting the body under significant amounts of stress. And if your nutrition isn't supporting the recovery from that stress, your immune system can become compromised. And there are a few key nutritional factors that can play an effect within your immune system. And the first, probably most important one, is your overall energy intake again. Especially if you're someone who's training hard and training a lot, if you're under fueling relative to the amount of training that you're doing, then this can suppress your immune system function. For example, studies have shown that athletes who are in a chronic energy deficit, meaning that they're consistently not eating enough to match their training demands, they're at much higher risk of getting ill. So the first thing I'd look at is whether you're eating enough overall to support the training that you're doing. And in order to assess that, you can look at, are you losing weight when you're trying not to, or are you feeling constantly fatigued, or are you struggling to recover between sessions? These can all be signs that you're under fueling, and if that's the case, increasing your overall calorie intake should be the first priority. Second factor then is your carbohydrate intake and your breakdown of your overall calorie intake to bias that towards carbohydrate once, for example, you've hit your protein targets for the day. Because when you're training hard, particularly with high intensity work, you're depleting those glycogen stores. And if you're not adequately replacing those glycogen stores with carbohydrate intake, this can actually suppress your immune function as well. And there's good evidence showing that athletes who consume adequate carbohydrates around their training have better immune markers compared to those who don't. As well as that, having a relatively high carbohydrate intake improves the chances that you're actually going to be consuming enough fiber, because fiber is a carbohydrate and is present in a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods, and that's something we'll talk about in a bit. But as well as increasing your overall carbohydrate intake, having sufficient carbohydrates before and even during particularly long sessions can help mitigate those effects of underfueling and how that can affect your immune function. Another factor that we touched on was protein, where adequate protein intake is crucial for immune function as well, because the cells, many of the cells and the antibodies and all the different aspects that make up your immune system are made from protein. So if you're not getting enough protein, your body can't produce these immune cells as effectively. Again, ensuring, as with any other protein target, we want to be hitting somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 2 grams, probably towards the higher end of kilogram per kilogram of body weight per day, spread across sort of 3, 4, even 5 meals potentially. Now, beyond the macronutrients, because many people will be hitting those targets and potentially still getting sick, their chances will be reduced. There are several micronutrients that are particularly important when it comes to immune functions. Vitamin D is a big one, especially during the winter months when we're not getting much sunlight. Zinc is another potential micronutrient that is involved within the function of your immune system. Vitamin C is another one that's been talked about a lot, and it's not going to, again, prevent you from getting ill, but it can potentially reduce the duration and the severity of things like colds. And then some other aspects we're considering is sleep, which is obviously very important for your immune function, and again, decreasing or allowing the body to recover from the stress it's undergoing as an athlete. And then finally, hydration can also play a role, knowing that it's supporting all of the body systems essentially, one of those being the immune system. Question 3 then, what are the non-negotiables for maintaining muscle mass when trying to amp up your running training? This is a really common challenge for people who are increasing their running volume and their intensity, say if they're training for something like their first marathon or even just marathons in general, but they're ramping up their training in order to work towards that. And the issue here is that running, especially at higher volumes, can create a little bit of a conflict when it comes to maintaining muscle mass. And it's not necessarily that the running itself is causing the muscle mass to reduce, but it could be the case that it is having other unintended effects that may lead to the reduction in muscle mass. This might just be as simple as the running training that you're doing is replacing some of the gym work that you used to be doing, and therefore you're not getting the same stimulus on the muscles through the gym work, or the quality and intensity of that gym work is reducing such that muscle mass then becomes something that is negatively affected. But in order to mitigate some of that, the first non-negotiable I would say is to look at and ensure that your protein intake is in a good place, because when you're in this high volume and intensity phase of running, your protein requirements can actually increase because you need the support of the protein for the muscle damage that occurs during endurance training, and you want the effects that protein itself can have on increasing muscle protein synthesis and potentially offsetting some of the muscle protein breakdown that may occur in longer or more intense sessions. So again, somewhere in that range of 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is a good place to start, and even edging it towards the higher end if you just want more of an insurance policy to ensure that you are maximizing the effects of protein as much as possible. The second aspect, which I already sort of alluded to, was the idea of continuing to strength train with as much focus as you can whilst managing the endurance training that you are doing. Because it's quite common that people who take up running as a sport and maybe are looking towards their first big endurance event, for example, will either cut out their strength training completely, or they will decrease it a lot in terms of the amount of it they're doing, the frequency that which they're doing it, or even just the intensity that they are given to it, wanting to be as fully recovered as possible for the running that they're doing, given that that's their goal. But it is important that if you are looking to maintain as much muscle as possible, that you put the stimulus on the body to cause it to have the adaptation of maintaining that muscle mass as much as possible. And with that said, you're probably not going to be able to train with the same volume as you would from a time perspective and from a recovery perspective compared to when you weren't doing these high volumes of running. But what you can do is decrease the amount of volume that you're doing, either through decreasing the frequency, the amount of sessions you're doing per week, as well as the number of sets you're doing, and even potentially the number of reps you're doing per set. But you can keep as much focus as possible on the intensity that you're giving to the exercises that you are doing. Again, giving the body the stimulus to say that you want to maintain that muscle and strength. Now, with that said, we're not looking to progress things as much as we would in a normal phase of training by trying to add on, an extra rep each week or an extra bit of weight in the bar each week. But if we are seeing that our strength within the gym and the weights that we're lifting for a given number of reps within an exercise is staying stable, then the likelihood is that we are maintaining the majority of that muscle mass. Now, along with those things, obviously having your overall energy intake at a level that is supporting the training that you're doing is going to be important, because no amount of protein or no amount of weight training is going to cause your body to be able to maintain the level of training you want to be maintaining whilst also holding on to as much muscle mass as possible if you're not giving it enough fuel in general. And given that you mentioned the level of volume of training and the intensity of it is going to be increasing, the likelihood is that your overall calorie intake will need to increase along with that. Now, you'd mentioned that you're trying to maintain weight and using that as your metric for ensuring that you're not losing muscle, and it's a good starting point because it suggests that your intake of calories is close to your maintenance intake range. But I'd also encourage you to monitor things like your performance in your running and in your strength training, because if your running is improving but your strength in the gym is dropping significantly, that might suggest that whilst you're getting more aerobically fit, you may be losing some muscle mass. But then on the other hand, if your gym work is improving but you are not able to keep up with the running demands, then the likelihood is that you may be swaying too far in favor of the muscle maintenance goals. Whereas if you drop that a little bit back to the point where you're able to maintain your strength in the gym, it might allow for a little bit more running volume and the recovery needed for that. So in summary, I recommend ensuring that you're getting adequate protein intake spread throughout the day, you're continuing to strength train and maintain your strength as much as possible, that you're ensuring your overall energy intake is in a good place, and that you're getting the right balance of the running and strength training.